The millionaire owner of the establishment sees two twin girls asking for just one cupcake to celebrate their birthday. Then he takes an action that brings the girls to tears. Nestled in a quiet corner of a small Texas town, the Sweet Heritage Bakery was one of those rare places where time seemed to pause. The smell of vanilla, cinnamon, and freshly baked bread wrapped around every visitor like a comforting blanket. The walls were lined with rustic wooden shelves, holding jars of homemade jams and vibrant displays of pastries, each more tempting than the last. Behind the counter, workers moved with rhythmic precision, unaware that the man seated alone near the window was no ordinary customer. Robert Clay, founder and owner of the Sweet Heritage chain, had built an empire from sugar and flour. Known across the country for his business acumen and philanthropic efforts, few could guess that the gray-bearded gentleman in a wool coat and baseball cap was the same man whose name adorned dozens of storefronts. That morning, he had arrived, without fanfare, asking only for a black coffee and a blueberry scone. He wanted to observe quietly. It was something he did from time to time, drop into one of his bakeries unannounced and feel the pulse of the place. It was just after 9:00 in the morning when the front bell chimed gently. Two little girls entered, identical in every feature. Same chestnut curls falling just above their shoulders, same wide hazel eyes, scanning the sweet-filled counters with awe. They couldn't have been older than 7. Their cheeks were pink from the cold, and they wore only one thick jacket between them, awkwardly sharing the sleeves as if it were a game. One of them clutched a small tin coin bank. They walked slowly, almost ceremoniously, to the counter. The bakery was far from crowded that morning, but even so, the sudden shift in energy was noticeable. The man behind the counter, a well-meaning young employee named Kyle, leaned down with a rehearsed smile. "Can I help you two?" The girls looked at each other and nodded. The one holding the coin bank cleared her throat. "We want just one cupcake, please," she said, her voice soft but hopeful. "It's our birthday today." Robert, sipping his now lukewarm coffee, froze mid-motion. He lowered the cup and turned slightly to get a better view. The tone in the girl's voice wasn't one of complaint or sadness. It was simply honest, full of a kind of joy that didn't depend on quantity. Kyle blinked, unsure for a second. Then, nodding, he stepped away to fetch their request. As he did, the girls placed the coin bank on the counter. The sound of coins clinking inside it echoed louder than it should have. Robert could see, even from where he sat, that the coins were mostly copper, pennies, maybe a few nickels. Not enough for a cupcake, he was certain, but Kyle didn't say a word. He returned with a vanilla cupcake topped with a swirl of pink frosting and a small sugar flower. "Here you go," he said, pushing it toward them gently. "Happy birthday." The girls smiled, faces lighting up as if they had been handed a treasure chest. They picked up the cupcake with both hands and carried it carefully to a nearby table. Robert couldn't stop watching. He noticed now neither of them wore shoes. Their small feet, red from the cold tile floor, peeked out from beneath the jacket they shared. And then, with almost sacred reverence, they broke the cupcake in two, each taking half with a whisper of thanks to the other. Something stirred in Robert's chest. It wasn't pity. He had seen enough hardship in his life to recognize dignity when it stood before him. It was something deeper, an ache that pulled from a memory not yet fully formed. He watched the girls chew slowly, eyes closed, as if savoring more than the sweetness on their tongues. He realized, almost with guilt, that he hadn't noticed the taste of his own scone at all. He stood, leaving his coffee untouched. The girls didn't notice. They were too absorbed in the small joy they held in their hands. He walked to the back of the store where the office was, nodding at a surprised Kyle on the way. Behind the closed door, he pulled out his phone and texted the store's regional manager. "Need to speak with the local manager. Urgent. Be discreet." He stared at the screen for a moment before slipping the phone back into his pocket. Through the narrow office window, he could still see them, two little girls in one jacket, laughing softly over a shared birthday cupcake. He didn't yet know their names. He didn't know where they came from or why they were alone. But he knew this much. Today was no longer just another regular day at the bakery. Robert remained, still behind the office door for a moment longer, watching the two girls through the small glass pane as they laughed and shared their precious cupcake. The entire scene had unfolded with such innocence, such gentle weight, that something inside him refused to let go. He had come to this bakery incognito to observe the staff, to audit the customer experience firsthand, but what he found instead was a quiet mirror to a past he seldom visited. He stepped out of the office and returned to his seat near the front, his eyes not leaving the table where the two girls sat. The employees went about their routine. The soft hum of the coffee machine, the occasional ring of the register, and the low murmur of background music all created a subtle rhythm that framed the contrast of the moment. The girls finished the cupcake slowly, each bite a small celebration. They wiped the frosting from their lips with the sleeves of the shared coat and giggled at something only they seemed to understand. Robert noticed how one girl gave the last crumb to the other without hesitation. Then they stood, taking the now empty paper wrapper and the tiny coin bank with them. They approached the trash bin with care, as if still trying to preserve the reverence of what the cupcake had meant to them. Before leaving, one of the girls turned around and looked at the interior of the bakery once more. Her eyes scanned the shelves and the glowing display of pastries with a wonder that belonged to fairy tales. Then, without a word, they walked to the door, pushing it open together and stepping back into the cold. Robert stood almost immediately. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but he knew he couldn't let them vanish into the streets of that small town without understanding more. He walked briskly to the front counter. Kyle, wiping down the espresso machine, looked up. "Who are those girls?" Robert asked, his voice low but intent. Kyle hesitated, glancing at the now empty table. "They come in sometimes, not often. I think they live nearby. Do you know their names?" He shook his head. "No, sir, they just show up every few weeks. Always together, always quiet. They never cause any trouble." Robert tapped his fingers against the counter, thinking. "What did they pay with?" Kyle frowned. "Mostly pennies, a couple of nickels, maybe 1 or 2 dimes. I didn't count it all, didn't have the heart." Robert nodded once. "Good." Then he turned and moved to the back again, this time requesting to see the manager directly. Within minutes, a woman named Claudia appeared, surprised to find herself face to face with the owner of the entire franchise. Robert pulled her into the office and closed the door behind them. "I need to know more about those 2 girls," he said without delay. "They just left. Do you have any information?" Claudia blinked, visibly caught off guard. "I mean, just bits and pieces. Locals say they live nearby with their grandmother. House is somewhere off Maplewood Drive. I think she's sick. People mention her sometimes, but no one knows much. For sure, the girls keep to themselves." Robert's thoughts turned, gears already spinning. He knew that neighborhood, run-down, quiet, mostly elderly residents. If the girls were from there, it made sense. But what didn't make sense was why they were walking barefoot in the cold, or why no one seemed to be paying attention to their needs. "Did you know today is their birthday?" he asked. Claudia's expression softened. "No, they didn't tell me. That's heartbreaking." Robert looked out through the window again. The streets were almost empty now, except for the occasional passing car. The girls were gone, disappeared like wisps of breath in the winter air. But he felt something had shifted. This was no longer just about curiosity. It was about something unspoken, perhaps redemption, perhaps duty. He left the office without another word and walked quickly out of the store, scanning the sidewalks, the streets, the spaces between parked cars. He caught a glimpse, 2 small figures moving quietly along the far side of the road. He followed, keeping distance, his pace steady but not invasive. The girls walked past shuttered shops and vacant lots, occasionally stepping around puddles and patches of frost. They didn't speak to each other now. It was as if the magic of the cupcake had worn off, and they were returning to a more familiar silence. Robert watched them turn into a small path, flanked by leafless bushes and broken fencing. At the end stood a house that seemed forgotten by time, paint peeling, porch sagging, windows clouded with dust. The yard was overgrown with weeds and littered with remnants of broken toys and rusted metal. They reached the porch and opened the door slowly, slipping inside with the same careful grace they had shown at the bakery. The door closed behind them with a creak. Robert remained where he was, not daring to step closer. He pulled a notebook from his coat pocket and jotted down the house number and street. His breath lingered in the air like smoke. The sky was turning grey, hinting at the snow that would likely fall before night. He stood there for another minute, staring at the house, committing every detail to memory: the missing shingle on the roof, the cracked steps, the small red ribbon tied to the porch rail. He returned to the bakery silently. No one asked where he had gone. He took his seat again, pulled out his phone, and sent a message to one of his personal assistants. "I need a background report on a property. Maplewood Drive. I'll send the address, quiet and quick." He stared at the bakery floor, still seeing the faces of the girls. He felt the weight of their laughter, the strength of their small hands holding that single cupcake, as if it were the most important gift they'd ever received. And perhaps it was. He knew that people passed scenes like this every day. Children, hiding need behind smiles, families struggling behind closed doors. But he couldn't be one of those people. Not anymore, not after today. There was too much of himself in those two girls, too many echoes of a winter long ago, when he too had stood in front of a bakery window with nothing more than hope in his pocket. And now, as a man who owned the glass, the shelves, and the entire world behind them, he understood better than ever that some debts could never be paid in full, but they could be honored, piece by piece, gesture by gesture. He would begin with them. The air had turned sharper by the time Robert Clay stepped outside the bakery once more. The wind bit through his coat, but he barely noticed. His mind was full, haunted almost, by the image of those two little girls, standing at the counter, eyes bright with the kind of hope that never begged, only believed. He kept returning to the moment they pulled out the coin bank, the soft jingle of coins that were almost exclusively copper. It wasn't just the poverty that struck him. It was the dignity with which they carried it. Not once had they looked ashamed. Back inside the store, he had replayed the entire interaction in his head, dissecting every frame like an old film reel. The moment they walked in, the way they leaned close to each other, the quiet tone of their voices. But there had been something else, something that made his breath catch. They had been barefoot. That single detail unraveled everything. It was winter in Texas, not the kind that dropped snow in thick blankets, but cold enough to redden skin and numb toes. The floors in that bakery weren't warm. They were ceramic, clean but unforgiving, and still they had walked in without shoes, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He couldn't let that go. Robert paced his study that evening, back in his private estate on the outskirts of town. The house was grand but quiet, filled with objects that meant little to him now. Art on the walls, shelves of books, a fire burning low in the stone hearth. Everything he had built was here, wealth, legacy, comfort, but none of it settled the unrest he felt since that morning. He called his assistant, a woman named Julia, who had worked for him for over 15 years. Her voice came through the speakerphone with familiar precision. "Yes, Robert? I need all public records for a property off Maplewood Drive," he said. "Sending the number now. Also, see if you can find any school enrollment records for 2 children. Twin girls, about 7 years old. First names might be Emma and Sophie, though I'm not sure. Check for recent charitable aid applications filed in that district. Anything that links to that address." There was a brief pause. Then, "Understood. I'll begin immediately." He ended the call and sank into the leather armchair by the fire. His mind returned to the cupcake. He imagined the texture of the frosting, the softness of the cake beneath, and how delicately the girls had split it. That moment, so small to the world, felt enormous to him. How many people had passed by them in recent months, in that same town, on that same sidewalk? How many adults had noticed their bare feet or the fact that they shared a single jacket between them? The next morning, Robert returned to the bakery, no longer interested in remaining anonymous. He entered through the front, dressed not in disguise but in a pressed charcoal suit, his silver hair neatly combed. Claudia, the manager, stood near the register, visibly startled by his appearance. Employees glanced over, murmuring to one another, unsure if they were being audited or honored. He walked past them all without speaking and stopped at the table where the girls had sat the day before. He ran his fingers along the wooden edge, pausing at a small indentation that looked like a name had been etched with a dull pencil. E. Place in a crooked heart. It made his chest tighten. Claudia approached cautiously. "Mr. Clay, is everything all right?" He turned to her. "I need to know if anyone here has ever seen those girls with an adult. Anyone at all?" She frowned. "No, sir. They're always alone. Sometimes one of them comes in without the other, but mostly they come together." He nodded. "Call the district's child welfare office. Tell them I'll be in touch. I want a representative who knows that area. Someone familiar with the families there." She didn't question him. She simply walked off to make the call. By noon, Julia had sent him a preliminary report. The house on Maplewood Drive was listed under the name Lucille Hayward, age 72, widow. She had filed no tax returns for the past 2 years. Utility payments were irregular, with several past due notices. No formal record of school enrollment for minors at that address. No recent medical claims. The profile painted a picture more revealing than any photograph. Lucille Hayward was slipping through the cracks. He stared at the document, reading each line twice. Something about the name stirred an echo. He couldn't place it, but it was as if he had heard it long ago. He put the report down and walked over to the window. Outside, the town stretched quiet and still. The streets, the rooftops, the horizon, everything seemed coated in a thin veil of sleep. And somewhere out there, those 2 girls were waking up in a cold house, perhaps with no breakfast, no shoes, and no reason to expect that the world might offer them anything more than a single cupcake on their birthday. He couldn't accept that. Later that afternoon, with a cold wind beginning to howl against the streets, Robert drove out toward the house. He parked at a distance and walked the final block. No one saw him. He passed the same crooked fence, the same overgrown garden, and stood once more in front of the weary door. He didn't knock. Not yet. He just observed. The curtains inside were drawn. A faint movement told him someone was home. He imagined Lucille inside, perhaps boiling water over a stove, wrapping herself in quilts while the girls played quietly, on the floor. Or perhaps they were out already, wandering the streets again, collecting coins and smiles from strangers. He scribbled in his notebook. Ideas, questions. A plan was forming, one that would take time, delicacy, and discretion. He knew better than to charge in with promises and money. Pride, he had learned, often lived strongest where resources were fewest. If he approached this wrong, he could alienate the very people he wanted to help. He would need someone who understood them, someone who could bridge that world and his. A social worker, a counselor, maybe a pastor from the community, someone trusted. But above all, he needed to meet Lucille, face to face, hear her voice, understand the fortress she had built around her family, and what it would take to gently walk through its gate. That night, Robert sat again by the fire, reviewing the report line by line. Then he looked around his home, the quiet, the warmth, the abundance, and wondered why it had taken one cupcake to remind him what all of this was supposed to mean. Not prestige, not wealth, not recognition, but connection, memory, the cycle of giving and receiving that had saved him once and now waited for him to return the gesture. Somewhere in that old house, a woman was doing everything she could with nothing. Somewhere behind drawn curtains, 2 girls had learned to celebrate life with half a cupcake and a whole heart. And somewhere deep within Robert Clay, something long buried had awakened, and it was not going back to sleep. The following morning, the air in the town had turned even crisper. A thin layer of frost glazed the sidewalks, and shopkeepers moved a little faster as they opened their doors, trying to ward off the chill. Robert Clay sat inside the bakery once again, this time not as an anonymous observer, but with full awareness from the staff that their presence was under his scrutiny. Yet he barely noticed the nervous glances sent his way, nor the fact that the baristas triple-checked every order before delivering it. His eyes remained locked on the front entrance, watching with a patience born not of routine but of purpose. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the 2 girls returned. Their arrival was silent, unnoticed by most patrons, but to Robert it felt like the moment the world tilted back into focus. Emma and Sophie entered, just as they had before. Quietly, hand in hand, their cheeks rosy and their coat buttoned up, unevenly between the two of them. The coin bank was back, and they approached the counter with the same humility, the same practiced hope. Claudia served them herself this time, her eyes softening as the girls placed their modest offering on the counter once again. "One cupcake, please," said Sophie. Or perhaps it was Emma. It was difficult to tell them apart without listening to them for a while. "It's still our birthday week." Claudia smiled, nodded, and turned to prepare the cupcake. Robert rose from his seat and walked slowly toward the back of the store, disappearing behind the kitchen doors. He needed time, just a moment, to steady the growing ache in his chest. The simple grace of the girl's routine had a way of stirring something too deep to name. He found Claudia moments later near the staff break room. She looked up, startled, to see him behind the scenes. "I need to speak with you," he said simply. They entered the office and Robert shut the door behind them. "I want to help them," he said, "but I need to understand who they are, what they're facing. I need to know everything you know." Claudia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her clipboard. "I've only heard things," she said, "from customers, from neighbors. They live nearby, a small house off Maplewood, with their grandmother, Lucille. She's older, not in the best health. People say the girl's parents died in a car accident a couple of years ago. Since then, it's just been the three of them." Robert absorbed this in silence. "No school records," he said. "No health claims, no assistance applications. They're invisible on paper." Claudia nodded. "They keep to themselves. I don't think Lucille wants interference. She's proud. One of those women who's taken care of everyone her whole life and doesn't know how to ask for help now." Robert leaned back, running a hand across his face. The weight of the situation pressed down on him with each new detail. He had seen stories like this unfold in the margins of society, where bureaucracy and pride collided, leaving the most vulnerable in the shadows. But never this close, never with faces he couldn't forget. "I want to go to them," he said, "but not as a benefactor, not as a millionaire who throws money and leaves. That's not what they need, not now." "Then how do you plan to approach them?" Claudia asked. "I need someone who can make the introduction," Robert replied. "Someone from within the community, someone who understands discretion." Claudia thought for a moment, then offered a name, a woman named Grace Turner, a retired social worker who volunteered part-time with the town's community center. She had spent decades building trust among families like Lucille's, often working outside the confines of formal systems to provide quiet support. Robert instructed Claudia to contact her immediately and arrange a meeting. Then he returned to the front of the bakery, where the girls were now seated, their cupcake halved once more, their smiles just as bright. He sat across the room, careful not to stare, and watched as they took turns licking the frosting from the top before biting into the cake. They shared everything, even the smallest indulgences, with a natural balance that came only from deep love and shared experience. He imagined the life they must lead inside that house, waking up to cold floors, perhaps lighting candles when the power was out, learning to keep their laughter quiet so as not to disturb their grandmother's rest. And yet here they were, joyful in a way most adults had forgotten how to be. Grace Turner arrived later that afternoon. She was a tall woman in her 60s with silver hair tied in a bun and eyes that held a calm authority. She met Robert at the bakery, and they spoke in the back office for nearly an hour. She asked questions not just about the girls, but about Robert's intentions, his methods, his expectations. She was not easily swayed by charm or wealth, and Robert respected her more for that. When their conversation ended, Grace agreed to visit Lucille's home later that week. She would present herself as she always did, offering a listening ear, not charity. If the door opened, she would let Robert know. Until then, he would wait. The girls returned to the bakery once more before the week ended. This time, Claudia gave them 2 cupcakes instead of 1 and told them it was a special deal, buy one, get one free. The girls giggled and accepted the gift without suspicion, their eyes shining with the kind of gratitude that spoke louder than any words. Robert didn't approach them. He simply sat nearby, a silent guardian of a moment that felt sacred in Its simplicity. He watched as they finished the cupcakes, stood, and left the store as they always did, hand in hand, back into the cold, with the smallest pieces of joy tucked carefully into their hearts. And as the door closed behind them, Robert made a silent vow. He would follow this thread, he would uncover the rest of their story, and he would do whatever it took to ensure that the next time they celebrated their birthday, it would not be with shared crumbs and copper coins, but with dignity, warmth, and the certainty that someone in the world had seen them and chosen to act. The early light of Saturday poured into the town with a soft golden hue, brushing rooftops and storefronts with a glow that almost concealed the biting cold. Robert Clay was already awake, dressed in a thick overcoat and scarf, his gloves clutched tightly in one hand, as he stood by the large bay window of his study. The fire from the night before had died to faint embers, and though the room was warm, Robert's thoughts remained fixed on a house miles away, a small broken structure with chipping paint and windows that hadn't seen clear glass in years. It was the place Emma and Sophie had entered 3 days ago, disappearing behind the sagging door like ghosts slipping between worlds. He hadn't returned since. He had waited quietly as Grace Turner made her first visit. She had gone the day before, armed with nothing more than a grocery bag and a warm smile, her silver hair tucked beneath a knitted hat. She had promised to speak with Lucille to get a sense of her disposition and to report back with discretion. Robert had wanted to go himself, but Grace had warned him against that. Too soon, too direct, and too much risk of being seen as a man trying to fix something with money instead of understanding. She was right. That kind of gesture might close a door before it ever had a chance to open. Now Robert sat at his desk and stared at the notebook he had been using to collect details. He had written down everything he knew, small facts, half-statements, observations that might seem trivial on their own, but together formed the outline of something urgent. The single coat, the bare feet, the way the girls spoke as if they were used to being careful with their words, the way they protected each other with their eyes. He had circled the words "no shoes" several times, pressing the pen so hard the paper had torn. It wasn't anger. It was disbelief. In a town like this, in a country like this, how could 2 children walk unnoticed, uncared for? By mid-morning, Grace arrived at the bakery to deliver her report. They met in the back office again, the same one where Robert had first said aloud that he wanted to help. Grace, always composed, wore the expression of someone who had seen too. Much to be easily rattled, but there was a weight in her shoulders now, something that hadn't been there before. "She let me in," Grace began, placing her gloves on the desk and smoothing the wrinkles from her coat. "Lucille didn't say much, but she didn't turn me away either. That alone says a lot." Robert listened without interrupting. The girls were home. They were sitting on the floor in the living room when I arrived, playing with paper dolls they'd made themselves. No TV, no radio, just silence, and those little cut-out shapes. "The place is..." She paused, choosing her words. "It's not safe, Robert. The walls are thin. The roof leaks. There's a space heater in the kitchen, and that's it for warmth. No insulation. I could see my breath in the hallway." He closed his eyes for a moment, trying not to picture it. "There's very little food," she continued. "A few canned items, some expired bread. Lucille said they get by with what they have, and that neighbors sometimes help, but I think she's too proud to accept more than the minimum. She has an old radio she listens to at night. No phone, no internet, nothing else." "What about the girls' education?" Robert asked. "They're not enrolled anywhere. Lucille teaches them at home, or tries to. She used to be a substitute teacher years ago. She showed me notebooks, basic arithmetic, spelling lists. But it's not enough. They're bright girls, but they need more structure, more than she can give, especially in her condition." Robert tapped his fingers against the desk, his mind racing. "How bad is her health?" "She didn't say much, but I saw the medication bottles. She's diabetic, high blood pressure. She moves slowly. I suspect chronic pain. She won't admit to needing help, but it's written all over her face, and she's scared. Not of people, but of losing them. Those girls are all she has." A long silence followed. Robert leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "I want to visit," he said at last, "but only if she's ready." Grace nodded. She's not ready yet. But I think she could be. She asked about you after I mentioned the cupcakes. She didn't seem angry, just curious. That was enough for now. Robert thanked Grace and returned to the front of the bakery, where the smell of cinnamon and baked apples hung in the air. He watched customers come and go, watched children run toward the pastry case, parents pulling them back with soft scoldings and quiet laughter. None of them knew what lived just down the road. None of them would guess that a few blocks away, two children shared everything they had and still went to bed cold. Later that afternoon, Robert stepped into his car and drove once more to the neighborhood off Maplewood. He parked a full block away and walked slowly, not with the intention of visiting, but to observe. From the corner, he saw the house again. It looked worse in daylight, stripped of the forgiving shadows that night had offered the first time. The porch had begun to sag even more, and a shutter had fallen from the window and now leaned awkwardly against the wall. As he stood there, the front door opened. Emma stepped out, her small figure wrapped in the same coat, her arms pulled tightly across her chest. She walked to the mailbox, an old rusted thing hanging crooked on the fence post, and reached in with both hands. There was nothing inside. She lingered for a moment, as if hoping that something might appear if she waited long enough, then turned and walked back toward the house. But she stopped. She looked directly at him. He froze. She didn't run or call out. She simply stared, head tilted slightly, as if trying to remember where she had seen him before. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stood there, still and quiet, and waited. After a moment, she gave a small nod. Not of greeting, but of recognition. Then she turned and went back inside, the door clicking shut behind her. Robert exhaled. It had been a second, nothing more, but it felt like a seed planted, one that might grow if given time, respect, and patience. He returned to his car and drove home, heart heavier but also steadier. He had seen enough now, enough to know that he would not look away, not from the cold, not from the silence, and not from the eyes of a little girl who, with a single glance, had asked him without words, "Will you come back?" The morning fog lingered over the town like a soft veil, blurring edges and muffling sound. Robert Clay awoke with an urgency in his chest that no amount of hot coffee or routine could quell. It was the same feeling that had haunted him each morning since the cupcake, the quiet realization that the world he had built, the empire of flour and sugar and smiles, had not yet reached the corners where it mattered most. It was not guilt that drove him, nor even charity. It was memory, and it had begun to stir with alarming clarity. At 8 o'clock he called Julia. "I'm done waiting," he said. "Set up a meeting with Grace and prepare the paperwork. To initiate a local investigation through our foundation. I want records, school, health, social assistance, anything that might help." Julia, always efficient, confirmed the task without hesitation. By 9 o'clock, Robert had already arrived at the bakery. Claudia greeted him, offering the same respectful nod she had grown used to giving in recent days. He passed through the kitchen and into the office where Grace Turner waited. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes carried the kind of weight only shared by those who have spent years seeing what others refuse to look at. "She's agreed to meet you," Grace said simply. "Not today, but soon. She wants to understand who you are first. She said she remembers your name from somewhere." That sentence clung to Robert like frost to a window pane. "She remembers me," Grace nodded. "Not as a billionaire, not as the bakery mogul, but from before, from a long time ago." Robert sat down slowly, fingers clasped together. "My mother died when I was 6, he began, unprompted. "My father had already left. I lived with my grandmother until I was 17. We were poor, not like today's poor, no phones, no social programs, no safety nets. I went hungry. I walked to school in shoes with holes. We used to make soup from bones and water. My grandmother worked nights cleaning a hotel. During the day, she sold pies to neighbors." Grace listened, not moving. "There was a woman on our street. I don't remember her face exactly, but I remember her voice. She would bring over canned food sometimes, blankets. She never made us feel ashamed, just helped when no one else did." He paused. "Her name might have been Lucille." Now Grace spoke, her voice low. "She was a teacher then, Substituted in 3 counties. Her husband died young. She helped whoever she could. Robert's breath caught. I think she helped me. I think I was one of her deliveries. Grace leaned forward. Then maybe this was meant to happen. Maybe this is not about charity. Maybe it's about finishing something that was started a long time ago. Robert said nothing for a moment, only nodding as his thoughts pulled him backward. Back to a small, drafty kitchen with cracked tile, where he once sat at a table too big for the room, eating a slice of peach pie given to him by a neighbor, who said nothing, just smiled. That afternoon, Robert requested a private meeting with the legal advisor for the Sweet Heritage Foundation, a division he had long kept at arm's length, used mostly for grants and education programs. He now wanted it mobilized for something personal, something immediate. He explained the situation without embellishment. There are 3 individuals, no official aid, no formal support. The children aren't in school. The guardian is ill. We need to build a program that supports them, but without exposing them. The legal advisor raised an eyebrow. You mean anonymous aid? I mean aid with dignity, Robert said. No press, no campaigns, no photos, just results. Do you have names? He paused. Not yet, just faces. Hand a house. The plan would involve multiple steps. First, contacting the local school board and securing a space for the twins. Then, engaging a discreet medical team to assess Lucille's health under the pretense of a community wellness. Check. Lastly, a quiet renovation of the house, 1 room at a time without relocating them, without alarming them. Volunteers would be sourced from within the town itself, preferably people Lucille might recognize. By the end of the meeting, the first draft of the operation was already forming. That evening, Robert returned to the notebook and found himself writing not just notes, but memories. He wrote about the first time he tasted cake, not one from a store, but one baked by his grandmother on his 8th birthday. A cake that leaned to one side, the icing too sweet, but made with love and flour she had bartered for with an old coat. He wrote about the time he sold newspapers to buy a second-hand pair of boots. And he wrote about the woman who left a sack of apples on their porch during the winter of his 10th year. Apples that were still red and unbruised, apples that had made him believe the world could be kind. He didn't know why he wrote it all down. Maybe to remind himself, maybe to leave something behind for someone else to read. 2 days later, Grace called. She's ready, she said. Robert didn't ask what had changed. He didn't need to. The past had spoken louder than any promise. On the morning of the visit, Robert wore no suit, no badge of wealth. He chose a sweater his grandmother had knitted before her hands grew. Too tired. A pair of worn slacks and shoes that had seen more pavement than boardrooms. He arrived at the house with Grace beside him. The air was brisk, but sunlight filtered through the bare branches of the trees, casting long, clear shadows on the pavement. Lucille opened the door before they could knock. She stood in a faded sweater and skirt, her hair pinned back in soft grey wisps, her eyes sharp and familiar. Behind her, the girls peeked out, their eyes wide and curious. I remember you, Lucille said. Her voice was the same as in his memory. You were the boy with the quiet eyes. Your grandmother used to save you the crusts of her pies. Robert smiled, his throat tight. And you brought us beans and blankets, she nodded. You turned out taller than I expected. They both laughed then, not out of politeness but out of recognition, the sound of 2 lifetimes looping back toward each other. Grace excused herself quietly, leaving them in the doorway. Robert looked down at Emma and Sophie. May I come in? He asked. Lucille stepped aside. Of course, anyone who remembers the crusts deserves to stay for supper. And just like that, the door opened, not just to the house, but to the story that had been waiting for years to be completed. The small living room had a stillness to it that could not be replicated by silence alone. It was the kind of stillness that came from years of necessity, from the discipline of conserving energy, emotional, physical, financial. The furniture was sparse and worn, not from neglect, but from prolonged use. A couch with flattened cushions, a side table held together with nails and prayer, a small bookshelf crammed with dog-eared paperbacks, most of them children's stories. And on the floor where the girls had been moments ago lay a neat arrangement of paper dolls and crayons, the world they had built in absence of anything else. Robert stepped inside, and the air seemed to shift around him. He didn't speak, right away. His eyes took in the room not in judgment, but with the quiet precision of someone who had once lived in spaces just like this. Spaces where every item had a story, every broken thing had once been new, and everything that remained was there for a reason. Lucille motioned for him to sit, and he chose the smaller of the two chairs, the one closest to the window. The girls had retreated to the back room, whispering between themselves with the urgency only children understood, trying to make sense of a man who had once been a boy in need, now seated in their home. Lucille sat across from him, her hands resting on her lap, fingers interlaced tightly, as if holding something in place that might otherwise fall apart. "I didn't expect to see you again," she said. "I didn't expect to be here," Robert replied. "But I'm glad I am." Lucille looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I remember your grandmother. She was proud, never took more than she needed. You were the same. You used to watch people, even as a child." Robert nodded. "She taught me that. She said if you watch long enough, people show you who they are." Lucille smiled faintly. "Smart woman." There was a brief pause before Robert spoke again. "Lucille, I need to ask you something. Not as a businessman, not as someone trying to fix things, but as someone who remembers what it's like to be in a room like this, hoping the roof holds through the night." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. "I want to help," he said. "I want to help the girls, and I want to help you. But I need to do it in a way that doesn't make you feel like you're being rescued. I know how that feels. I've been on the receiving end of well-meaning people who made me feel small." Lucille leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing, not with suspicion but with curiosity. "Why now?" she asked. Robert hesitated. "Because two little girls walked into my bakery and bought one cupcake with pennies. Because they were barefoot. Because they shared it like it was a feast. And because it reminded me that somewhere along the way I forgot what mattered." Lucille looked toward the window. Outside, the branches swayed gently in the wind, casting flickering shadows across the floor. "I'm not proud," she said softly. I've raised a lot of people, students, neighbors, my own children. And when the accident happened, when their parents were taken, I told myself I could do it again. But this time, my body isn't what it was. My strength has changed, and I'm scared of what happens if I ask for help and it's the wrong kind." Robert leaned forward, his voice steady. "Then let it be the right kind. Let it be invisible if it needs to be. Let it be gentle." She turned back to him. "What do you propose?" And just like that, the door opened. Not physically, but in her tone, in her posture, in the way her fingers relaxed slightly in her lap. Robert explained everything, not in terms of money, but in outcomes. He spoke of a community initiative that would discreetly offer home improvements under the guise of neighborhood beautification. Volunteers who wouldn't ask questions. He described a scholarship fund that would be named after Lucille herself, not the girls, so they wouldn't feel exposed. He outlined medical assistance that would arrive as part of a pilot health program in underserved neighborhoods, with Lucille as one of the first participants. More than the details, it was the way he spoke that mattered. There was no pitch, no persuasion, just quiet intention shaped by experience and delivered with respect. Lucille listened, her face unreadable, until he finished. "You thought this through," she said. "I had help," Robert replied. "Grace, Claudia, a few others who care more than they let on." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The girls like you." He smiled. "They don't even know me. They know enough. Kids can tell who sees them and who doesn't." There was a soft knock at the doorway of the room. Sophie peeked in, followed by Emma. They hesitated until Lucille nodded, then came forward, slipping onto the couch beside her. Their eyes flicked between Robert and their grandmother, trying to piece together the invisible threads of the adult conversation. Robert turned to them. "Do you two still like cupcakes?" Both nodded. "Would you like to help me make some?" Their faces lit up, and Lucille laughed, a sound that carried years of fatigue and affection in equal measure. "I think they'd like that very much." Later that afternoon, back at the bakery, the girls stood behind the counter for the first time. With the staff's gentle guidance, they helped pipe frosting onto cupcakes, their small fingers clumsy but determined. Robert watched from the kitchen door, arms crossed, a quiet smile on his face. Customers looked on with curiosity, some recognizing the girls from their earlier visits. None knew the full story, but all felt the warmth of the moment. Lucille sat in a booth near the window, sipping a cup of tea brought to her by Claudia. She said little, but her eyes stayed on the girls the entire time. When the cupcakes were finished, Emma and Sophie each carried a tray to the front display, placing them with care next to the others. One had their initials swirled in frosting on top. Robert approached the counter. "I think we should name that one the Twins Special," he said. Sophie beamed. Emma nodded solemnly. Lucille raised her cup in silent agreement. And just like that, something shifted, not just in that store, but in the quiet architecture of their lives. Not a rescue, not a handout, but a hand offered, steady and sincere, building something new on the foundations of something long remembered. The days that followed moved with the quiet rhythm of something just beginning to heal. Robert Clay's plan had begun to take root, not as a project, not as an intervention, but as a gesture of restoration. The bakery became a subtle headquarters for coordination, with Grace Turner quietly mobilizing volunteers, Claudia organizing supply deliveries, and Julia working behind the scenes to ensure every form, every fund, and every service appeared as natural as a ripple in a pond. Everything seemed aligned. But life, as Robert well knew, rarely follows the architecture of intention without disruption. It began with Lucille. She had agreed to the first wave of renovations. A team of volunteers was scheduled to repair the roof, reinforce insulation, and replace a section of the porch that had long threatened collapse. It was supposed to be simple, discreet. But when the workers arrived with their unmarked truck and soft voices, she met them on the porch, her arms folded tightly across her chest, and refused entry. Grace was called in, and Robert arrived shortly after. They found Lucille seated in her living room, her face drawn, the girls curled beside her, confused by the sudden tension. "I changed my mind," Lucille said firmly. "I can't have strangers coming in here, not like this, it's too much." Robert took a slow breath. "We'll go at your pace. We can postpone the work. Just tell me what you're feeling." Lucille's voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the strain of holding something in too long. "I've held this house together with my own hands for years. If I let go of that, if I let other people fix it for me, what am I then? What do I have left?" Grace stepped forward gently. "You have your story, your dignity. Those things aren't taken by help, Lucille. They're only lost when you believe you don't deserve help." Lucille looked at Robert. "It's not that I don't trust you. It's that I don't trust what comes after. Today, it's a roof. Tomorrow, someone decides I'm not fit to care for them, that I'm too old, too sick, and then they take them from me." The room went silent. Robert knelt in front of her, his voice low. "No one is taking those girls. Not while I can breathe. I don't work with systems that separate families. I build around them. I won't let anyone touch this one." Lucille searched his face, and something there must have reached her. She didn't agree. She didn't nod. But she didn't ask them to leave. That night the work was paused. The volunteers were sent home, the materials stored in the bakery's delivery shed. Claudia kept them guarded, as if they were family heirlooms. Julia drafted a revised plan, one that began with non-invasive repairs. A new water heater installed from outside, weatherproofing windows without entering the house, and providing firewood for their old stove. Each adjustment was designed to respect Lucille's space while continuing to move forward. But then came the second obstacle, less expected and more painful. The school district responded to the inquiry Robert's team had made weeks earlier, informing them that Emma and Sophie had been marked as truant for over a year and that their household would be reviewed for compliance with state education laws. The notice was cold, bureaucratic, and immediate. It did not ask why the girls had been absent. It did not recognize Lucille's attempts to homeschool. It simply labeled the situation a violation. When Robert read the letter, something inside him shifted. He wasn't just angry, he was furious, because the very system designed to protect children had once again moved faster to punish than to understand. He made 2 phone calls, one to a trusted lawyer, the other to a local journalist he knew from earlier community work. The story would not be aired. It would not become a scandal, but it would be used behind the scenes to apply pressure where needed. Grace met with Lucille that same afternoon. The letter had already arrived. She found her sitting in the kitchen, hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the table. "I knew it," Lucille whispered. "I knew they'd come for them." "They're not," Grace said calmly. "You're not alone this time. Robert is already working on it." Lucille's eyes filled with tears, not the kind that fall easily, but the kind that hover in the eyes of someone who has been forced to be strong for too long. "They're my babies," she said, "all I have left." Grace took her hand. "And they'll stay that way." Robert arranged a meeting with the superintendent of the district. No cameras, no threats. Just a conversation in a quiet room with documents laid neatly between them. He brought the girls' homemade schoolwork, detailed notes from Lucille's teaching efforts, and a newly formed plan for official tutoring, offered at no cost through a local retired teachers' cooperative. The superintendent, a middle-aged man with a tired smile and nervous fingers, finally relented. The girls would be registered for a formal homeschooling program under state supervision. There would be check-ins, yes, but no charges, no removal. No headlines, just support. When Robert delivered the news to Lucille, she didn't speak for a long time. She simply reached out and placed her hand over his. Her grip was light, but it said more than any words could. In the following days, the air around the house began to change. Slowly, carefully, adjustments resumed. A carpenter came to mend the broken back door. A neighbor, discreetly enlisted by Grace, dropped off a space heater without asking questions. A retired nurse visited under the pretense of doing community outreach, checking Lucille's vitals and refilling her prescriptions. And at the bakery, Emma and Sophie became unofficial mascots, their presence drawing smiles from regulars and giving the staff reason to place 2 extra cupcakes on the tray every Friday afternoon. One night, as Robert sat in his study, looking over reports from the foundation, he found himself staring at a picture Sophie had drawn. It was of the bakery, simple, colorful, and full of crooked shapes. But at the center stood a man behind the counter, holding out a cupcake. Above him, she had written one word: safe. He folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his notebook, between the pages of his own past. Then he closed it. Not every plan unfolds without struggle. Some require pauses, realignment, and the resilience to continue when doors seem to close. But in the heart of that small house and the walls of a bakery born from memory, something greater than charity had begun. Not a gift, not a transaction, but a partnership between what was broken and what could be rebuilt, not just with nails and wood, but with understanding and time. The bakery was quiet before opening hours, filled only with the soft clinking of pans being placed into ovens and the rhythmic hum of early preparation. Outside, the town remained hushed under a soft gray sky, the streets damp with the memory of an overnight drizzle. Robert Clay sat at his usual corner table, a cup of dark coffee cooling beside him, his hands resting on a folder he had yet to open. He wasn't there to oversee operations that morning. He had asked the staff to leave him be for a while. What filled the space between his silence and the hum of ovens was not planning, but remembering. He opened the folder slowly. Inside was a collection of papers that had nothing to do with bakery business. Letters, photocopies of public records, old articles. Julia had spent the last few days tracking down pieces of his childhood, the parts he hadn't touched in decades. Among them was a photo, faded and creased, of a young boy with solemn eyes standing in front of a brick apartment complex. His shirt was too big, his shoes mismatched, but his stance was firm. Robert traced the edge of the photo with his thumb and let the silence hold him. He had spoken with Grace the night before, not about logistics or next steps, but about what had been reawakened in him. It had started with Emma and Sophie and a cupcake, but it had led him down a path lined with memories of hunger, of cold, nights of being unseen, and more than that, of the people who quietly and without glory had seen him anyway. He remembered his grandmother's hands, gnarled from years of work, as they kneaded dough in a too-small kitchen. He remembered how she would tuck a piece of newspaper into the soles of his shoes to block the holes when the rain came. And he remembered, most vividly, the rare days when a brown paper bag would appear at their doorstep, filled with food and soap, and once, miraculously, a box of colored pencils. Those pencils had changed everything. He used them on scrap paper, on old envelopes, on the backs of cereal boxes. He drew things he'd never seen, cakes with swirls of frosting, houses with warm lights in every window, people smiling at dinner tables. It had been Lucille, though he hadn't known her name then, who had left that bag. She had never spoken about it. She had never waited for thanks. But he remembered her figure retreating down the sidewalk, her grey coat flapping against the wind. He spoke now because silence had served its purpose. It had built walls, it had guarded his heart, but now it had to be broken down. If not for him, then for the girls who had reminded him what it meant to need without asking. When Grace arrived later that morning, he was still holding the photo. She kept everything, she said, setting down a stack of books beside him. Lucille, report cards, birthday cards, notes from teachers, even a school flyer with your name circled. She remembered you. Robert didn't respond right away. Instead, he opened the books. They were children's books, many of them worn, the kind that teachers once gave to students who showed promise. Inside the cover of one was a note written in loopy, slanted handwriting, "To Robbie for the stories you'll write one day." "Mrs. H, I never saw this," he whispered. "She never stopped believing in people," Grace said, "even when they forgot her." That sentence lingered like fog. Later that day, Robert walked the path between the bakery and the girls' house. It was a walk he now knew by heart. The cracks in the pavement, the uneven fence, the soft creak of the gate. The house looked different now. The porch had been repaired. A fresh coat of paint covered the front door. There were still signs of wear, but now they were mingled with signs of care. Lucille was sitting on the steps when he arrived, wrapped in a shawl. She looked up, her eyes squinting slightly in the late afternoon light. "You've been digging," she said without preamble. "I needed to," he replied, "to remember what mattered." She patted the step beside her and he sat down. "I never told anyone," he said, "about what you did for us. My grandmother always said not to thank people for kindness they gave without asking. Said it cheapened it. But I see now it just made me forget to honor it." Lucille was quiet. "For a long time. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because someone once did it for me. That's how it works. The thread goes on if you let it." He looked out at the yard. A swing now hung from one of the trees. Grace's doing, he guessed. The girls had drawn chalk shapes across the driveway. Stars, animals, stick figures, with wild hair. The sun caught the colors and turned them almost luminous. "Emma wants to be a baker," Lucille said suddenly. Robert smiled. "She's got a good teacher. She has you too now." He shook his head slowly. "I'm just trying to be what I needed." The words sat between them, warm and solid. That evening, at the bakery, the staff prepared for the coming weekend. Cupcakes were lined in perfect rows, new signage placed near the display case. In one frame was a photo the girls had drawn, two girls behind a counter, a man handing them a cupcake, and above it all the words, "Home is where the sweets are." Robert looked at it and felt something shift. Not the dramatic turn of a life upended, but the slow, steady pivot of a heart remembering how to open. That night in his study he wrote a letter, not for the press, not for the board of directors, but for the girls. He didn't know when he'd give it to them. Maybe not for years, but he needed the words to exist. He told them about a boy who once stood in the cold outside a bakery, too shy to go in, about a woman who left gifts with no name, about a grandmother who made magic from flour and fire, about the way a cupcake shared with care could become a doorway to a better world. And he ended it with a promise. "You won't have to stand in the cold again. Not while I'm here. Not while I remember." He folded the letter and placed it beside the photo in his notebook. Then he sat back, and for the first time in many years, let the silence feel like peace. The dawn broke without urgency, painting the sky in subdued tones of gold and grey, as if the world itself was holding its breath. In the center of town, the Sweet Heritage Bakery sat bathed in the soft morning light, its windows slightly fogged from the warmth inside. But today it didn't open at the usual hour. A handwritten sign had been placed on the door the night before, closed for private event until noon. Curious passers-by peered through the glass, puzzled but respectful, catching only glimpses of the quiet bustle unfolding within. Robert Clay stood at the far end of the bakery, sleeves rolled up, hands slightly dusted with flour. He hadn't touched dough in years, not since the days of his first shop when every loaf and pastry passed through his own hands. But today he insisted on baking, not out of necessity, but because it mattered. Every detail mattered. Claudia and the staff moved around him with practiced ease, decorating tables, arranging trays, adjusting lighting. Grace Turner arrived just before 9 o'clock, carrying a small box of handmade decorations and a folder tucked under her arm. She handed the folder to Robert without a word. Inside were 2 simple pages, birth certificates issued years ago, faded and folded, but still legible. Emma Jane Hayward, Sophie Rose Hayward, born on a Tuesday 7 minutes apart. Robert ran his fingers over the paper with the same reverence he might give to an old hymn. At 10 o'clock, the final touches were in place. The entire bakery had been transformed, not extravagantly but thoughtfully. Balloons in soft pastels floated near the ceiling. Streamers made from recycled paper the girls had decorated during their recent visits hung between the windows. In the center of the room stood a table covered in a white cloth, atop which rested a cake unlike any other they had ever seen. It was not oversized or ostentatious. It was layered in delicate swirls of frosting, with 2 giant cupcakes standing, like crowns on either side, each adorned with a name in hand-piped letters, Emma and Sophie. At 11:30, Robert checked his watch. A few invited guests had begun to arrive. Quiet figures from the neighborhood, volunteers from the community center, the retired nurse who now visited Lucille weekly. They were all given strict instructions. No cameras, no applause until the moment was right. No mention of what had been done for the family. Today was not about gratitude, it was about dignity. Outside, Lucille stood at the edge of the sidewalk, holding the girls' hands as they looked at the bakery's door. They had not been told what was inside, only that it was a surprise. Emma clutched a small drawing rolled in a rubber band, and Sophie wore a mismatched ribbon in her hair, found in a donation box and chosen with care. When they stepped inside, the room seemed to pause. It wasn't the decorations or the cake that made them stop, it was the faces. Every person there had met them not with pity, but with warmth. There was no whispering, no eyes darting with judgment, only smiles, familiar, kind, and real. Then from the far side of the room, a chorus began, not loud or perfect, but sincere. The staff, the volunteers, the neighbors all began to sing Happy Birthday in soft harmony. The girls froze. Their eyes grew wide, their mouths parted, and then they turned slowly to Lucille, whose hand tightened slightly in theirs. Lucille whispered, "It's for you. Go ahead." Emma took the first step, Sophie right behind her. They walked slowly toward the cake, their eyes never leaving the cupcakes that bore their names. When they reached the table, they stopped and stared, as if trying to understand whether it was truly meant for them. Robert stepped forward, kneeling down to their height. "This is your day," he said, "all of it. Every minute, every song, every sweet thing in this room. You don't have to share it, but you're welcome to share it with everyone here if you want to." Sophie looked up at him. "Even the cupcakes," Robert smiled, "especially the cupcakes." The room chuckled gently, and the spell broke. Emma reached out and touched the frosting with one finger, then licked it, giggling. Sophie followed. The crowd relaxed, the singing faded into soft applause, and the celebration began. No one asked them to make speeches. No one pressed for photos. Instead, they were allowed to be children in the truest sense, dancing in uneven steps to the music, running between tables, laughing as if their bodies had remembered something they hadn't felt in years. Lucille watched from her chair near the window. Grace sat beside her, both women wrapped in the same kind of silence that didn't need words. Eventually Robert joined them, setting down 3 small plates with slices of cake and folded napkins. "I haven't seen them this free in a long time," Lucille said, her voice almost lost in the sounds of celebration. "They were never caged," Robert replied. "Just waiting for someone to open the door." Lucille looked at him. "You opened it." "I just remembered where the key was." Later, as the event began to wind down, Robert noticed the girls huddled near the cake table again, whispering. Sophie held the drawing Emma had brought. They seemed to be debating something, their faces earnest and intense. Then, with shared resolve, they approached Robert, holding the rolled paper out to him. "This is for you," Emma said. "It's us," Sophie added, "but also you." Robert took the paper and unrolled it slowly. It was a crayon drawing of 3 figures standing in front of the bakery. One was tall, with a beard and a cupcake in each hand. The other 2 were girls, both smiling, holding hands. Above them, written in purple letters, were the words, "Thank you for seeing us." He didn't respond right away. He couldn't. His eyes stung, and his hands trembled slightly. He knelt and pulled them both into a hug, not tight, not overwhelming, but steady. They held on for a long time, neither rushing to let go. That night, as the bakery returned to quiet and the last balloon lost its lift and drifted to the floor, Robert sat alone at the counter, the drawing beside him. He thought of everything that had led to this moment, every cold step, every quiet tear, every day those girls had gone unseen. They were no longer invisible. They were known, and that, more than the cake or the song or the crowd, was the gift that mattered most. The sun was beginning to set, casting elongated shadows across the bakery's front windows, bathing the interior in a golden hue that seemed to stretch time itself. The last of the balloons had been untied and gathered in a quiet cluster near the back. Traces of frosting still lingered on the display counter, and the scent of vanilla, sugar, and warm bread hung heavy in the air. The celebration had ended hours ago, but its warmth had not left. In the center of that stillness, Robert Clay remained seated, elbows resting on a linen-draped table, the girl's crayon drawing carefully placed before him like a treasured map to a place he never wanted to forget. The room was nearly empty when Lucille entered again, her pace slow, hands clasped lightly at her waist. She didn't speak right away. She simply moved to the chair opposite him and sat down with a calm that felt earned, not from ease, but from years of carrying more than anyone should have to. "They fell asleep as soon as we got home," she said after a long silence. "Still had frosting on their cheeks." Robert smiled faintly. "They earned it." Lucille's eyes drifted to the drawing. "They worked on that all week, practiced the lettering, chose the colors together, kept hiding it under the mattress so I wouldn't see it." "They wanted it to be perfect," Robert murmured. Lucille nodded. "For you." The air between them shifted, not with tension but with anticipation. She reached into the bag at her side and pulled out a small envelope, placing it gently on the table between them. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice even, "and I need you to hear it all before you say anything." Robert sat straighter, his hand brushing the envelope but not opening it. Lucille continued. "I didn't remember your name at first, not when Grace first mentioned you, not when the girls told me about the man in the bakery. But it came back to me the night you visited the house. The way you spoke, the way you looked around, not to judge but to understand." She exhaled slowly. "You were the boy who used to sit under the big tree near 8th and Braxton. You always had a pencil in your hand and nothing to write on. I brought paper once, remember?" Robert's breath caught. He hadn't remembered that detail, but as soon as she said it, the image returned. Him sitting cross-legged beneath that old oak tree, pencil in hand, scribbling against a flattened cereal box. And the paper, cream-colored, lined, folded into a rectangle with a rubber band. "You brought 3 sheets," he said quietly. "Told me not to waste them." Lucille gave a small laugh. "I remember. You used all 3. Drew a house on one, a cake on another, and a man with a cape on the third. I said he was a baker who saved people." Her eyes met his. You were always writing your future, even when you didn't know it. Robert looked down at the envelope again. What's this? A thank you, she said. And a record. Inside is a statement from the foundation, the one you created in the girl's name. I know you never meant to show it to us, Grace explained. Everything. That the house repairs were logged as part of a neighborhood restoration project, that the medical help was funded anonymously, that the education plan was registered under a community outreach pilot. Robert remained silent. I also know, Lucille continued, that you set up a trust, one that will follow them until they're old enough to choose their own paths. Health, school, home security, all accounted for. Robert looked up. They deserve every bit of it. I know they do, but that's not why I'm here. Lucille leaned forward, her tone shifting from gratitude to clarity. I'm not just thanking you, I'm telling you this because I need you to know what it means. You didn't just hand us a gift, Robert. You gave us peace. I've lived most of my life trying to protect others, trying to stretch one day's strength into two, and for the first time in years I feel like I can rest. Not because the fight is over, but because someone else is holding the line with me. She reached over and placed her hand on his. It was warm, weathered, steady. You didn't just help us, she said. You honored a promise you didn't even remember making. Robert nodded slowly. I'm remembering more every day. Lucille smiled. Then let this be part of that memory. She gestured toward the envelope once more. Inside, Robert found a photo. It was old, sepia-toned, edges frayed. It showed a younger Lucille, standing outside what looked like a school, her hand on the shoulder of a small boy with tousled hair and scuffed shoes. The boy's face was unmistakable. It was him. There was a teacher there that day, Lucille said. Took that picture. Said you had potential. I kept it, thinking maybe one day I'd hear your name on the radio or read it in a paper. Robert held the photo like something fragile. You kept this all this time? I keep things that matter. He stared at the image. The boy looked unsure, even wary. But the hand on his shoulder, the quiet presence beside him, told a different story. A story of being seen. I don't know how to thank you, he said. Lucille shook her head. You already did. You showed up. You stayed. You saw them. The moment lingered, not as a farewell, but as a turning point. They sat there in the golden wash of light. Two people bound not by blood or obligation, but by the long, winding thread of kindness that had traveled through time, weaving its way from one life into another. Eventually, Lucille stood. We should go. They'll be looking for me. Robert rose with her. They'll be all right. They already are. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. You're part of this now, not because of what you gave, but because of who you were before you ever had anything to give. And then she was gone, the bell above the bakery door chiming softly in her wake. Robert returned to his seat, the photo still in his hand, the envelope now resting beside the drawing. He looked at both and understood what had truly been built, not a safety net, not a charity program, but a legacy of acknowledgement, of recognition, of love that asked nothing in return. He sat there until the light faded, thinking not of cupcakes, or profits or plans, but of paper bags on doorsteps, pencils on cereal boxes, and the quiet, steady hand of someone who had once believed he could become something more, and who now, without question, had helped others do the same. Morning light poured through the windows of the modest home on Maplewood Drive, no longer filtered through cracked glass or warped panes. The windows had been replaced, the walls reinforced, and the floorboards, once soft with rot, now felt solid underfoot. The house still wore its age with quiet dignity, but now it was dressed in the unmistakable signs of care. Outside, the garden had begun to change as well. Where wild grass once ruled, small planters now brimmed with herbs and flowers placed carefully by the community volunteers under Lucille's reluctant but eventual approval. Robert stood on the porch, watching the wind rustle through the trees. Behind him, laughter spilled from the living room, where Emma and Sophie were playing with Grace, who had arrived earlier to deliver new books and check in on Lucille. The warmth that filled the house had nothing to do with the repaired insulation or the new heater. It was the kind of warmth that came from presence, from safety, from the knowledge that today would not be a struggle to survive. Lucille emerged from the kitchen, a dish towel slung over her shoulder, and handed Robert a cup of tea without ceremony. They had long since stopped needing to explain such gestures. He accepted it with a nod, and they sat together in the late morning quiet, watching the town wake up around them. "They're learning fast," Lucille said, her voice soft but proud. "Sophie's already asking to read bedtime stories by herself. Emma pretends to teach her dolls math." "They're going to thrive," Robert replied. "You built the foundation. I just helped steady the walls." Lucille looked at him for a long moment. "You're too modest. I'm just old enough to know the difference between giving and being given the chance to give. You offered me that chance. I didn't ask for it, I didn't deserve it. But I took it, and I'll keep taking it for as long as I can." She smiled, and they sat in silence once more. By mid-afternoon, the bakery was busier than usual. Word had spread, quietly, respectfully, that something meaningful had happened there. Not a story in the papers, not a social media campaign. Just people telling people, neighbors telling neighbors that something rare had bloomed in that warm little shop. Emma and Sophie were now unofficial junior helpers, arriving every Saturday morning to assist with labeling boxes or organizing shelves. They wore matching aprons stitched by a local seamstress, their initials embroidered in thread. Customers would come in and recognize them, sometimes pausing, sometimes smiling, but always giving space. It had been agreed, unspoken but universally understood, that this was sacred ground. No one asked questions. No one brought up the past. They simply accepted the presence of the girls as something right and good, like sunlight after a storm. Robert continued to come daily. Sometimes he sat at his usual table, scribbling in a notebook filled with half-written thoughts. Other times, he moved among the staff, offering quiet support. More often than not, he found himself simply watching the way Emma lit up when someone complimented her frosting skills, the way Sophie carefully stacked boxes as if arranging treasure, the way customers left not just with pastries, but with something warmer in their chest. One Thursday afternoon, Julia approached him with a new proposal. The foundation had identified 3 other families in similar situations, grandparents raising children alone, slipping through the cracks of formal aid systems. Robert read through the reports carefully. He didn't respond right away, instead turning the pages over in silence. Finally, he said, "Let's expand, but not as a charity. No banners, no brochures, quiet hands, one at a time." Julia understood. The plan would move forward with the same principle that had guided everything thus far: dignity first. Meanwhile, Lucille's health had begun to stabilize. The nurse who visited weekly reported improvements in her blood pressure, her mobility, even her sleep. She laughed more now. She allowed herself small indulgences, reading for pleasure, letting the girls paint her nails on weekends, eating cake without apologizing. Her strength had not returned to what it once was, but she no longer had to carry everything alone. And in that release, she found a deeper kind of resilience. Robert visited the house often, sometimes bringing small gifts, a new book, a bag of fresh apples, a scarf he thought might match Lucille's coat. But more than that, he brought presents. He sat through school sessions, listening as Sophie recited multiplication tables and Emma read aloud. He played card games with them on the floor, built puzzles, even helped paint a cardboard castle that now took up half the hallway. One evening, as they finished dinner together, Sophie asked him, "Did you have birthdays when you were little?" He paused, caught off guard. "Not like yours," he answered honestly. "No cakes, no decorations, but my grandmother always made me soup. She'd put a potato in it, even when we didn't have much. That was her gift." Emma leaned her head against his arm. "We'll make you a birthday cake this year." He smiled, unable to speak. The promise held. On his birthday, he arrived at the bakery to find a cake waiting. Small, simple, topped with a sugar potato made of fondant, and 2 hand-drawn cards. One said, "You make life sweet." The other said, "Thank you for being our soup." Oi laughed, and then he cried. Later that night, he stood alone in the bakery after closing. The cake was gone. The chairs were upturned. The lights were dimmed. He stood at the display case, staring at the empty shelves. What had started as a moment, a cupcake, a coin bank, two small girls with cold feet, had become a revolution. Quiet, gentle, invisible to the outside world, but monumental in its reach. He thought of his grandmother, of Lucille, of Emma and Sophie, of every person who had passed him by when he was a boy, and the few who had stopped and stayed. And he thought of the chain, the invisible thread, the way one act of care, given without demand, could echo forward into lives never imagined. He walked to the door and turned the lock, pausing to look back one last time. Tomorrow would come. More cupcakes, more coffee, more quiet miracles. But for now the day was done. The chapter had changed, and for the first time in a very long time, Robert Clay knew, deep in his bones, that something had been set right. Not fixed, not finished, but set on the path toward light. It was a year later to the day. The calendar marked the same quiet date that had once held no meaning for anyone beyond a single house on Maplewood Drive. But this year, the air felt different. The town awoke with a kind of still energy, as if something sacred lay just beyond. The ordinary, something small but powerful, shaped not by grand gestures but by the echo of a single act of kindness. Robert Clay stood in front of the mirror in his hallway, straightening his collar. His suit was plain, dark, well-worn, the kind of garment worn by someone who no longer needed clothes to speak for him. He didn't hurry. He didn't prepare a speech or a plan. The day didn't require one. It had already written itself in the lives of two little girls and a woman whose quiet strength had carried generations. He stepped outside and walked to the curb where his car waited, but before opening the door he paused. Across the street, coming down the sidewalk hand in hand, were Emma and Sophie. They had grown in ways that transcended inches or shoe sizes. They moved with confidence now, no longer hiding behind sleeves or ducking their heads. Their clothes were clean, colorful, chosen. Their shoes were laced tight. Their hair was brushed and tied with simple ribbons. And in each of their free hands, they carried something. Lucille followed a few steps behind, leaning on a cane but walking steady. Her presence had shifted too, no longer shadowed by fatigue or the dread of uncertainty. She was not merely surviving, she was living. And each step she took seemed to say, "We are still here, and we are whole." When the girls reached Robert, they didn't say anything at first. They simply looked up at him, eyes clear, steady, older, in ways that had nothing to do with time. "We made this for you," Emma said, holding out a small white envelope. "And this," Sophie added, presenting a cupcake. It was handmade, slightly lopsided, the frosting imperfect, but the lettering, across the top written in tiny, careful piping, was unmistakable. "Thank you." Robert took the cupcake and the envelope without speaking. He looked down at the envelope as if it might vanish if not handled carefully. Then he opened it. Inside was a folded card. On the front, drawn in bold crayon strokes, was the image of the bakery. Inside, the scene of their birthday 1 year ago had been lovingly recreated in color. The cake, the balloons, the people standing in gentle applause. But it wasn't the drawing that made his breath catch. It was the words written beneath it. "You saw us when no one else did. You reminded us that we matter. You made us feel real. We love you. Always." His throat tightened. He tried to speak, but the words refused to come. Instead, his eyes brimmed and he felt the first tear fall before he could stop it. Not from sorrow, not from regret, but from the overwhelming weight of having been chosen to witness something so rare. Lucille stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You gave them back to the world," she said, "and you gave the world back to them." He nodded slowly, still unable to speak, still holding the card like scripture. Around them, the street was quiet. No one stared, no cars honked, no one intruded. It was a moment shared only by those who knew its cost, its beauty, and its truth. They entered the bakery together, the four of them. The staff had already prepared a small table near the window, where two cupcakes with the girls' names waited on ceramic plates, surrounded by a few scattered flower petals and a single candle, unlit. Claudia greeted them with a smile and a nod. No fuss, no announcement, just understanding. They sat together and Robert lit the candle with a match pulled from his pocket. As the flame flickered to life, Emma and Sophie each closed their eyes and made a wish, not out loud, not for anyone else to hear. When they opened their eyes again, they blew the candle out in perfect unison. Afterward, they shared the cupcakes, just as they had 1 year ago. But this time they each had their own. No need to break it in half, no need to count the coins, and yet they offered Robert a bite, one from each plate, laughing when he made a face of exaggerated delight at the taste. Lucille watched them, her eyes glistening not with sadness, but with joy so profound it threatened to spill over. She reached into her bag and pulled out something wrapped in tissue, an old photo frame, polished and repaired. Inside was the same photo she had given Robert a year ago, now duplicated, the younger Robert beside her, and next to it, a new photo taken just last week. Robert, Emma, Sophie and Lucille, standing in front of the bakery, all smiling. "We thought you should have them together," Lucille said. He held the frame, unable to look away. "This is everything I ever wanted, and I didn't even know I needed it." Outside, the sky turned from grey to blue, as if giving its blessing to the day. The street bustled with life, unaware of what had just unfolded inside the walls of a simple bakery. But those who passed felt something in the air, something gentle and lasting, like the scent of fresh bread or the echo of a song you haven't heard in years. The girls ran off to the back of the bakery, where the staff had set up a small decorating station. Lucille walked slowly to the counter to chat with Claudia, and Robert remained seated at the table, the cupcake finished, the frame beside him, the card folded neatly in his jacket pocket. He looked out the window and watched the world go by. And as he did, he made a promise, not aloud, not with fanfare, but silently, in the quiet of his heart. He would never forget this day, never forget this year, never forget what it meant to be part of someone's restoration. He would keep seeing, keep showing up, keep holding the line, because once, long ago, someone had done the same for him, and now it was his turn, his joy, his purpose, his legacy,